everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I love to dye yarn, but color mixing is not a strength of mine. So today I am really excited to work with a color expert and the sponsor of today's video, Alanna Wilcox. Alanna is a talented fiber artist and has developed this incredible color matching system where, starting with a digital image, she can create a recipe using various acid dyes, so that way you can get a physical color match that will match the color, the digital color that you started with. This is awe-inspiring, jaw-dropping, and the examples that she has shared with me are amazing. I have thought that her color matching is really incredible for a long time, and I'm really excited to try out one of her recipes in today's video. Alanna's color matching system works with over 2,000 different hex codes, and there are more colors out there than 2,000, but she can work with you to help select the color that is the closest match for the color you want to create. Alanna's recipes use up to 20 different colors across a few brands, including Dharma, Jacquard, Greener Shades, and ProChem. You can make some substitutions for different colors or even food coloring, but you might need to tweak the recipes a little bit because the system was developed with this particular set of colors. Each custom color recipe is $14.97, and if you buy 5 or more colors, you will get a digital dye database for these colors where you can manipulate your dye stock concentrations and the amount of fiber you want to dye, and it'll automatically adjust the recipe to suit those variables for you. So I wanted to pick a color that both would have a little bit of a complex recipe. I wanted a complex recipe, and that would be personal to me, because if I'm going to create a custom color, it should be something that feels personal. And I decided to go with the tie that my husband wore at our wedding. It's purple, which happens to be one of my favorite colors, and this is a garment that we still have in our possession, and Keith will wear it on special occasions, and so it felt like the perfect color to try to match. The first challenge that I have is to try to get a digital color that matches the tie. And this was a little bit harder than I originally anticipated. I started off by going to Home Depot and getting some paint swatches that closely matched the tie to try to use it as a reference. And then I went and photographed the tie in a lot of different types of lighting and conditions. I even tried scanning it on my scanner to try to get something that would accurately represent the color. And I want to take this moment to say I think it would have been easier if I tried to pick a digital color from one of the wedding photos versus trying to go from the physical item, because now we're having like 2 different stages of color matching where I'm starting with a physical item, going to a digital color, and then I'm going to be taking that digital color to go to a physical item. So that's more steps than maybe we would have had if I just started with the digital color. And there's a reason why a lot of listings online, including my own shop, say that the colors in person may differ from what you see on your screen. I took one of the pictures of the tie and I tried editing it so that way the digital swatches of these paint chips would match the physical paint chips in the picture. That made things a little bit more blue. I played around with it until I got a version of the tie that felt like on my phone it matched what I saw in person. Then I shared this with Alanna, and she helped me pick out some hex codes that were the closest to colors that would work with her system and that she thought would be the best match for me to dye yarn to match the tie. And Alanna does offer color consultation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to her directly. Once we finally settled on the first digital color we were going to try to match, Alanna worked her magic and sent me a recipe for this color. And my recipe used 7 different colors from 3 to 4 different brands. For the purposes of this video, I am going to be referring to the colors as Blue 1, Blue 2, instead of the actual brand colors. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves and started making stock solutions of these 7 colors. For most of the colors, I measured out either 1 gram or 1/2 gram of dye and dissolved it into a total volume of 100 milliliters or 50 milliliters respectively to get that 1% stock solution. I needed a lot more of pink 1, so I measured out 3 grams of dye and dissolved that in a total volume of 300 milliliters. The reason why I measure out the volume of the dye stock instead of just measuring out the volume of liquid I'm going to add is that technically the dye powder does add volume to the overall solution. And so this is something that is mainly a throwback from my lab days. The best way to make an accurate concentration is you do need to consider the volume of what you are dissolving into your liquid. If we were dyeing larger quantities of dye, it could be easier to weigh out the amount of dye powder that we would need for each of the colors. But since I'm only dyeing 100 grams of yarn, or if you're going to dye a mini skein, it is much easier to measure out a small volume of liquid than it is to measure out a tiny amount of dye, even if your scale is rated to 0.01 grams like mine is. And here we have 7 1% stock solutions that I mixed for this project. We have black, green, brown, pink 1, which is really more of a soft red, blue 1, blue 2, and then pink 2. I added a little bit more of this pink 1, mainly because I wanted to get a better sense of the relative hue. But what I will note is that it is less pigmented, less intense than some of the other colors, which makes some things from the recipe make a little bit more sense. Unfortunately, I do not have a color printer. Our recipe is over 50% pink, which I knew from a lot of purples I have mixed in the past that I do tend to need a lot of pink versus blue, but I was still surprised with how much more pink there was and how little there are of the two blues, which ultimately come down to a little over 5% of the total mixture. Of course, we do have blue in our green and some blue in our black, at least visually, and so I'm very excited to see this mixture come together. Now, our recipe comes with a percentage breakdown of the formula to tell us how much black we need to blue and things like that. But it also then tells us how much of a 1% stock solution we would need to get the final color. And if you add up all of these volumes, the total is a little bit over 146 milliliters, which may surprise you because if you add all these volumes together, you still have a 1% stock, but this will give us on 100 grams of yarn about a 1.46% depth of shade. And the reason why the total will not add up to 100 milliliters is that the formula also takes into account the depth of shade required to match that hex code that we have. And so if our color was more pastel, then the total volume that we would have would probably be much less than 100 milliliters. Of course, the final depth of shade may need to be adjusted from the recipe. And so Alanna actually recommends that you dye up a swatch or mini skein first, show it to her so then she can offer suggestions on how to modify the recipe or the amount of time the yarn is on the heat based on the base, so that way you can match the digital color you are going for. And if you have Alanna's dye calculator, changing the amount of volume you need for a 20 gram mini skein from a 100 gram mini skein is super easy. The calculator can also recommend a volume of liquid that you would want to mix if you are going to do, say, a hand painted technique versus an immersion technique. And then it'll recommend the amount of water that you should add to get a good volume for that hand painting. And again, the reason why we went for making stock solutions to begin with is that it is significantly easier to measure out 4 milliliters of a 1% stock solution than it is to weigh out 0.04 grams of dye with any kind of precision. We still have some small and larger volumes that we need to measure out, and to measure out the volumes of dye, I will be using a combination of graduated cylinders and graduated syringes. In general, when you are measuring out volumes of liquid, you want to use a tool that has as close to the volume you need to measure out as possible. So for example, I wouldn't use a 100 milliliter graduated cylinder to measure out 4 milliliters or 10 milliliters of liquid. To measure out 4 milliliters of liquid, I'll use a 5 milliliter syringe, and to measure out 16 milliliters of liquid, I'd use the 20 milliliter syringe, etc. If you're concerned about any of the volumes being a little bit too small to measure, then you can change your stock solution from, say, a 1% stock to a 0.5% stock, or even a 0.25% stock, where you have your 1 gram of dye dissolved into 200 milliliters or 400 milliliters of water respectively. Then you would just need to measure out a larger volume of that dye, which can sometimes just be a little bit easier to measure out. However, this is only something I recommend if you're going to do something like kettle dyeing, where your volume of water with your dye doesn't matter as much. For hand painting, I'd want to stick with Alanna's measurements. And so now I am going to start measuring out the dye, and I'm actually going to measure out 3 sets of each color because I'm going to dye 3 different skeins of yarn, just so that way we can see how this might look on different types of yarn bases. And I'm not dyeing it all in one pot, and so that's why I want it separate. So I'm going to need 23.99 milliliters of the black. And sometimes if there's bubbles, you might need to wait for that to go down. And then sometimes with graduated cylinders, you can like use a Pasteur pipette to help you get to that final volume. Now, obviously, I am not able to accurately measure out 23.99 milliliters, but I'm able to get pretty close, and so that is what I am going for. I think that you could do a mixture with using some 1 milliliter pipettes to try to get like even closer, but I figured we'll try with a more rough shot first, doing approximately the volumes, and then see what we may need to do. Next up is 6 milliliters of the green, and I'm making sure to stir the stalks nicely before measuring up the volume. Let's start in the back one. So adding the green to the black, what splashed up looked very, very blue, which is very fun. Maybe having these in a triangle might make it a little bit hard for me to remember which one still needs the color, but hopefully I will remember. I'll put them in a line. I'll put them in the line. Okay, for brown, I'll need that graduated cylinder again. I used at the beginning. I did wash it out after the black, and I need 23.32. And so I will do my best. It'll probably be closer to the 23.5. Let's get a Pasteur pipette. And this is basically just like an eyedropper to allow me to slowly finish off the volume that I need for this color. Yeah, with dealing with liquids that are this opaque, it can be a little bit more challenging to measure out a volume, just because it's harder to see like the markers and stuff, or on the syringe to see where the black is, but with practice, then it's really not that bad. Awesome. All right, this pink did not dissolve as well as some of the other colors, but we're gonna do our best. So I need 68.26 milliliters. And we are gonna do our best to get just a little bit above 68. And I will continue to measure. Oh man, that one I got almost exactly, but I want to go a little bit above. With everything that you measure, there's always some error involved, unfortunately. But we will know when we see the final color, once that yarn is dry, how we may need to edit things going forward, and if the color is a little bit too pink or too dark or too light, and so if we need to have like a deeper depth of shade, we have this recipe that then we can tweak, which is a little bit easier than if I just started mixing like purple and black or something to try to hit this color. Oranges are a bit easier. Okay, I need just over 4 milliliters of blue 1. And a hair less, but again, just over 4 milliliters of blue 2. And I'm doing this project today with freshly made stock solutions, so that way things are as well mixed as they can. There was nothing that really settled or crashed out of any of these solutions. This final pink is one that can be a little bit tricky in a stock and settle. So as you play with colors, you will know what colors behave well and what don't. So I need a 16.6 milliliters here. A little bit over 16 and a half. 15, 16, a little bit over. Over. And the nice thing about doing these 3 at once is it's a little bit easier to measure out 3 samples of one color, one after the other, like I'm doing here, than it is to do all the colors once and then go through and do it again. It's just easier. And now we have 3 cups, and honestly, I can't really tell what the color is. It's looking a little bit black, but I can test this on a paper towel, but I'm going to wait and do that with maybe my 3rd sample. But for now, let's wait and see what it looks like in the pot once we add our yarn and everything all together. In my 8-quart stainless steel pot, I just added 16 cups of water. And now I have our mixture here, which I am adding to the cold pot. There's no acid in here. And I am gonna go rinse out the cup. And now we're gonna give this a really, really good stir. And as for the color, I mean, it's definitely looking purpley, but I think it's still gonna be a little hard to tell until we see what it does on our yarn. I pre-soaked 100 grams of Knit Picks Stroll fingering weight yarn, 75% Superwash Merino, 25% nylon, in some plain tap water for a couple of hours. And now, ooh, I am adding it into the pot. Ooh, and let's look at the hex code again to see where we are. Now, the color will probably look different wet versus dry as well. And so if the color ends up being too pigmented, then we know we'll need to reduce some things. So I'm adding the yarn to the pot cold and stirring it around. And the reason why I'm setting things up cold and sort of letting it sit and I'm stirring it is that we want all of the pigments that are in here to bind as evenly as possible. And if I had started out with a hot dye bath and acid, some of these colors would break because there are pigments in here that I know strike really fast, other pigments that strike slower, and so it would still be really, really pretty. But given that we are attempting at this point to try to match a color swatch, this I think is our best bet. And of course I'm looking at it, I'm like, ooh, it's feeling fairly deep, but it's really pretty. Now my tap water is slightly acidic, so at times I do see colors start to strike when things are cold. And so that can happen here, but that's why we're just starting cold and giving a good stir. I do have a removable nylon zip tie on the yarn. I use this to like hold it, and so that way I can stir without getting things super tangled. I'm now going to go ahead and add 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. Now I could have removed the yarn before I did that to try to, again, help keep things even. Where's my spoon? But, you know, I'm sort of going about this carefully, but giving myself room to not be super rigid with it, so that way If there are things and we notice that there is some breaking, then we know some things to change for next time. But you'll notice that we're seeing a lot of color in the yarn already, which is fun. So now what I'm gonna do is take this over to the stove so we can start heating things up. Okay, we are over at our stove and I just turned it on. Now I have my tongs to help stir. And I'm gonna check in and stir occasionally just to try to help keep things even. But it's funny, it still looks like there's a ton of pigment in the water, but when I remove the yarn, it looks like there's a ton of pigment on the yarn itself as well. So we are gonna now, I guess, heat this up until we get just below a simmer. It has only been a couple of minutes. And ooh, there's some yellow left. When I checked a little bit ago, there was just like a little bit of something black leaning, but it looks like there's just some yellows left, which maybe are from the brown, maybe from the green, I don't know. But I'm still waiting for this to come up to temperature. But the color here is so pretty. Oh my goodness, I am so excited to see what this is gonna look like dry. Oh my goodness. The water has mostly cleared and we are now hot. I just reduced the heat on the gas burner and I do want to make sure that it heats for at least 30 minutes now that we are at temp. We are very steamy, but the 30 minutes are up. Where's the zip tie? Here it is. And the dye bath is looking pretty clear. I'm going to turn off the heat and go ahead and let the yarn sit in here for a little bit, but I will remove it shortly to set it aside to cool so we can wash it. While the first pot was heating up, I set up my second pot, also with 16 cups of water and our 146 milliliters of the color that we mixed, to dye a second skein of yarn. This skein is Knit Picks Gloss Fingering Weight yarn, which is 70% merino wool, 30% silk. I decided to dye this gloss as well because I thought it would be a fun comparison to what we see on the Stroll and how when you're using a recipe, it is important to take the yarn base you're using into consideration because a lot of times yarn with silk content does need more dye to feel as pigmented. And so here we're using the exact same amount of dye, the exact same conditions we were using on our Stroll. It's just this time it's a non-superwash merino silk blend. Once I added the yarn, stirred things up, I added 4 tablespoons of white vinegar and then took it to heat until the dye had exhausted off camera. But now I have to wonder, and I'm going to do this with our third sample of dye just because the color that we're going to start with for that yarn isn't white, and so therefore if there is a drop less of the color, it's not going to make as much of a difference as with the Stroll and the silk. But that is what our dye looks like at the 1% strength. And so that, to my eye, looks a little bit more red than our black, but doesn't quite capture that purple that I see. And so this is something else I should bring up. I oftentimes when I'm mixing colors will check to see how the pigments are looking by using a drop on a paper towel. And that can be helpful with certain colors. If you want to know if you've got a green that's leaning too blue or too yellow, it can help you there. But for this deep muted purpley hue, it's harder to say what it's gonna look like from the drop. And so I was just interested to see how that turned out. We'll see if we end up noticing any breaking over here, but we do see some breaking on the paper towel with the brown. And that could be some of those yellow pigments that we're seeing at the end of our Stroll. Over time, the paper towel dried, and this spot here is looking a lot more purple to me. And I do see a bit of breaking. There is a little bit of a pink halo around the color. Similar, actually, to that like watermelon halo we have there. There is one final base I want to dye with this custom purple, and that is a skein of Wool to Die For's That Yak sock yarn. This yarn is 70% superwash merino, 20% yak, 10% nylon. And this is not an off-white bare yarn. It is more of a warm toned gray, cool toned brown, oatmeal-y color because of the yak fiber in there. And so this color of the bare yarn is going to influence the final color that we see more than the color of the bare yarn did in the other two cases. I dyed the yarn using the same conditions I dyed the other skeins, 16 cups of water, add our dye, add the yarn, stir things up, and then add 4 tablespoons of white vinegar to then heat it on the stovetop off camera while the dye exhausts. Because the color we are dyeing today is a very saturated color, the color of the That Yak yarn isn't going to make as big of an impact as it would if we were dyeing a brighter or paler color. But I do expect to see some kind of difference between this and the Stroll and the gloss. I still technically have enough of my various dye stocks to mix up a 4th sample of this custom color. But instead, I thought it would be fun to dye some minis at a 1% depth of shade of each of the 7 colors that I used. While this is not going to reflect the proportion of the various colors going into our purple, it means that we can see all the colors we started with compared to the finished yarn, and I thought that would be fun. In some plastic containers, I added 1 cup of cold tap water and then 10 milliliters of each of the various dye colors. Next, I added a pre-soaked 10 gram mini skein that was Sheila's Titanium from Wool to Dye For, 75% Superwash Merino, 25% nylon, to each of the cups, stirred things up, added 1 teaspoon of white vinegar, stirred things up again, and then covered the containers, let them sit for a day or so before removing the yarn to steam set it, and then washing it all off camera. I haven't corrected the white balance here, but I will say that on camera the 3 colors look very, very similar. In person, oh, okay, there's the yak. I was like, why do they look so similar? So right now, this is the Stroll, that is the gloss. You can see it's got some sheen to it. And this is the That Yak, which is definitely darker than the others. But it's not as, like, the difference isn't as extreme as we've seen in some other instances where I've compared That Yak to other colors. So yeah, I guess I don't know how this will compare to the tie. We'll have to compare it to what I think of it with the hex code, the digital color that we picked, because I don't think there was like a perfect match for the tie, but we did the closest. But also the tie, because it's silk, has like, looks different colors and different lights. And so we'll see if we need to modify the recipe more for this color. But the good news is there's no color bleeding, and I have not gone, you can see the silk is looking lighter already. I have not gone and looked at the tie during this whole project. And I'm very proud of myself for not doing that. So that way we can sort of evaluate the color. So in person, these colors feel cooler toned than they're looking on the monitor, where I think they're looking a little bit more redder. So we'll just have to see how things look. But when we have the dry yarn, and I wonder if I still have the paint swatches I used. I will try to control the lighting in the area at the end as much as I can. But anyway, there's no bleeding, so I'm going to just finish rinsing out the soap, put the yarn through my spin dryer, and then hang it up to dry. Here are 2 of the yarn bases, our Stroll, the Superwash Merino blend, and our gloss, the non-Superwash Merino silk blend, with 2 of the paint swatches that I had at the beginning, or at least that I photographed with the tie at the beginning. And I would say that the colors are pretty good, but I think that they are still a little bit too red for what the tie is. So here's our tie, which is actually a really, really good match for the color we got on the silk. Although the tie has definitely got more blue than both of these colors. I am surprised there's such a huge difference between the gloss and the Stroll, and that it's not just, you know, feeling a little bit less saturated, which it is, but in both cases, I think that a little bit more blue would have helped. But I'm really, really glad that I dyed the silk, because I think that the color isn't quite as deep, but the hue is closer than what we have on the Stroll. I also dyed a skein of wool to dye for's That Yak, mainly because I wanted to show that the base color of the bare yarn that you are starting with does influence the color that you are dyeing, which I know is something that should feel a little bit intuitive, but just like different fiber blends can absorb color differently because the color of those bare yarns is much more similar. But starting with a bare yarn that isn't white will shift the color, and so if you're trying to achieve a specific color on a specific blend of fibers, that is something you need to consider. Now let's forget about the actual tie for a moment, although I do have it slightly on screen just for my own reference. How does this yarn match the digital swatch that the recipe was based on? This is a question I'm gonna have to answer more when I have this footage on my actual screen. Okay, I just took a picture and brought it over, and I'm comparing the yarn to the hex code, and it is pretty close. I would say that maybe this yarn is still a hair more red than what I see digitally. I would say that that's pretty good, and that like what I'm seeing on screen is matching here pretty well. It's an overcast day, so I think that, I mean, right now what I see on my phone looks pretty accurate, but I was struggling to get the paint swatches and the tie to look accurate when I was doing the original images. And so right here, I would say closer to my hand, I have the gloss, which if you look closely, you can see almost like breaking. It almost looks heathered. That's so pretty. I think maybe the wool and silk absorb some colors differently. And then the Stroll is closer to my elbow. And so out here, I would say the color match looks much closer than it does inside. But also, there are multiple colors in this tie that before I thought it was just a reflection, but I think that there is legit like a striping in there. And so a different color in those like more striped sections and then those more like other sections, which is very funny and something I didn't notice before. But anyway, I am actually currently working on a bluer version of the color to see if we get a better match with that recipe. That is on the stovetop right now. And so why don't I take you over and talk about that process, and then we'll look at all the colors all together. But actually, I'm still on my phone back inside, and here the color difference between the tie and the other yarn just feels more striking than what it did outside. And so I'm convinced that this tie is a chameleon. Oh, but anyway, let's go talk about the other color I'm dyeing. I could have tweaked the original recipe that I had, but Alanna actually gave me a second recipe that was bluer, and I decided to go ahead and give that one a shot. The colors were mostly the same, except there was a purple in the lineup this time and a third version of pink versus the two pinks that I had used in my first attempt. I measured out two versions of this colorway because I wanted to dye another skein of Stroll plus a skein of gloss because that ended up being really close on the first version. This time our color is mostly a purple and then pink, black, and brown with bits of those green and blues thrown in. Those make up a much more minor part. Once again, I used my graduated cylinders to measure out the volume of these 1% stock solutions, which I didn't film myself making them, but they are 1% stocks, as precisely as I possibly can. I did make one mistake during the measuring. For Blue 2, I measured out 6.1 milliliters instead of 5.61. I think when I was thinking of the 0.61 that I needed, I was thinking, okay, I need 6.1. So it's about half a milliliter too much of that color, which shouldn't have an enormous impact, but is something that I definitely want to make a note of, because if I'm repeating this, then, well, I have a slight shift to this recipe. I added 24 cups of tap water to each of my kettles and then added in the purple dye that we had mixed, which absolutely is a lot bluer than the last one, and not just because of my little mistake, but because the recipe is for an overall bluer color. If you look at the two swatches, one of them is bluer. I then added the pre-soaked yarn to each pot. I didn't want to dye the yarn together because I want the depth of shade that we see to be what is from the recipe versus letting our superwash yarn absorb more color than the non-superwash silk yarn. I let the yarn sit in the pot for about 10 minutes before I added 6 tablespoons of white vinegar to each pot, stirring up the yarn to distribute the acid around to help us get a fairly even color overall, and then brought the pots over to the stove to start heating them up. So that way all of the color could bind to the yarn. Once each pot was at temperature, I let it heat for at least 30 minutes or until all of the color had absorbed. Here is our Stroll from our second round, and it is heated for 30 minutes. The color is feeling pretty deep, so I'm very curious to see how this will feel next to the tie. It feels like it's probably too saturated. I don't really want to bring the tie over here, so I am not doing that, but it may be a little bit closer. And of course, there's still pinks that have not absorbed. This is a kind of pink that I'm gonna have to turn off the heat and let the yarn cool completely in the pot, so a lot of those pinks will absorb. And with our gloss, I would say something similar, although the color, actually it's also feeling pretty deep. I did add 3 tablespoons of white vinegar to each pot at some point, but yeah, I'm gonna let things cool off, absorb those pinks. The real answers will come once the yarn is dry. So that's what I'm most excited to see. There was a little bit of pink left in the pots, but after letting the yarn cool off overnight, I went ahead and washed both skeins of yarn in some cool tap water using a little bit of dish soap to help rinse out any unbound color. Thankfully, there was not significant bleeding of any kind, so I put the yarn in my spin dryer and hung it up to dry. All right, here we've got the first color I tried and the second color I tried. And I will say this one feels like it might be a bit too blue to me, but let's take our tie and look, and whoa. Okay, that's actually pretty cool. It's really, really cool. I'll try to take these outside in a little bit, but I think that there are elements in here where this color is spot on, maybe some of that dark stitching, but it really, really depends on the angle that you're looking at it on. Okay, because see those darker sections of the tie, sort of in between those stripes, like those deep sections there, that feels like a really good match for this color on the Stroll. But again, I changed the angle and like what you see just looks different because of the way the tie reflects light. But yeah, I would say overall the first color is a little bit too red, the second one's a little bit too blue, but I think that with playing around with these two, that they could actually be blended together because I think that there's an element of the mutedness that we're pretty close to. If I adjust the white balance, see, it's hard to show what I see because in my eye, the tie looks like a really good match on the two silks. Maybe a little bit more red here, a little bit deeper and more blue than up there. But yeah, on camera, the tie is looking like way more different. It's not bad, really not bad. Let's forget about the tie for a little bit, even though I still have the paint swatches and everything in here, just as a bit of a control, honestly. So that way, as I look at and compare the different scenes, we can see how the changing in the white balance affects the color of those swatches. Yeah, that's funny because the colors don't look as different in person as they do on camera, but we did try 2 different muted purples, and I think that they actually are pretty close to the digital swatches. Of course, there's a caveat of when you take a look at a digital image versus what you see in person. Purples are notoriously hard for this, but especially given the original photo that I gave to Alanna to try to match, I think that we did a really good job. Editing Rebecca popping in. I just put the digital color swatches on top of the yarn. I did not edit the image of the yarn at all, and they match the gloss yarn, the merino silk yarn, so well. I am so impressed with how similar these look to the digital swatch. I mean, I shouldn't be that surprised. I've seen Alanna do side-by-sides of the yarn and the color that she was dyeing for, but it's pretty awesome to see that comparison. And I think that the color for the Superwash yarn could be close, but I would just need to reduce the total amount of dye because it seems like it's a bit too saturated there. But anyway, this was so cool to just like overlay those color swatches on. I'm outside in the shade with the tie. In person, I would say it looks really, really close to the second silk right there. On camera, I don't see it as much though. On camera, the tie is picking up a little bit different, but that is really, really fun. It continues to amaze me that in different lights and different configurations and how in person versus on camera, everything is just looking so different to me. It's so amusing. Yeah, and if I change the direction of the light source, you can see how washed out those paint swatches now look. It's just the way that the light hits and bounces. Everything looks a little bit different. Communicating colors and digital colors can be such a challenge. That's why services like Pantone exist, because they define a shade, and when you buy one of their mega expensive books, you can look at the color and someone else can look at the color and you know you're talking about the same color. I am still so amazed really that I combined these 7 colors to create this purple. And we used a similar palette, but actually 2 different reddish colors. We had a completely different pink and we had a purple instead of that color to create this color over here. And I just think that that's really, really fun and really cool. Now, not every recipe is gonna require 7 different colors. If you're concerned about the number of colors you might need to match your digital color, definitely reach out and chat with Alanna about it. I'm coming upstairs to film the conclusions, and I mean, that match looks so good in here. Oh my gosh. The light and the environment makes such a big difference. It's amazing how similar all of this yarn looks now that we're in a different lighting situation. I mean, even our yak isn't that far off. I've mentioned this already, but colors that you see on your monitor do vary from what you see in person, and the lighting conditions you are under does matter when you are photographing something. Furthermore, there's a reason why dye lots exist, and if you follow the exact same recipe 2 times, it's possible you could get a perfect match, or there could be a slight variation in the color that you see. And actually, this is a video that I would like to do again. I would like to do a complex recipe and then try to replicate that, so that way we can just see how similar or different maybe our colors end up. If that's something you would like to see, please leave a comment below. But where do we go from here if I want to try to get a closer match to the tie from the yarn that I dyed? And there are a few tweaks that we could continue to do. If we wanted the match on the Stroll, we could try leaving the yarn in the dye pot for a smaller amount of time, or we could decrease the total amount of dye that we're adding to adjust that depth of shade. We also could tweak the recipe and actually create a recipe that is a combination of the 2 colors to see if that brings us closer to where the tie actually ends up. I am beyond impressed with this color matching system and these recipes. Now, I did make things a little challenging for myself by starting with a physical item, trying to get a digital color swatch that matched the physical item, and then going to the yarn. And so the process would be easier if you started with a digital image in the first place that you were trying to match. It was so fun for me to work on a color recipe for something that is so personal to me. And Keith was even impressed when he saw the yarn next to the tie. He was just like, whoa! If you would like to go beyond the kind of color matching that we did today in your own dyeing journey, Alanna is creating a Color Alchemy Masterclass, The Science of Color and the Artistry of Dyeing. This masterclass will take you beyond just color matching. Alanna will take you through breaking down color theory beyond just looking at the color wheel, complementary colors, and analogous colors. She will help you learn to create recipes with your own spin on the color, to pull color palettes from inspiration images, and more than I can describe here. If you would like to learn more about the masterclass, you can sign up for Alanna's mailing list through her website, so you can find more information once the course, is out of beta testing and is available for everyone to sign up. Alanna Wilcox, thank you so much for sponsoring this episode of Dyepot Weekly. I have had so much fun starting this color matching journey and playing with these custom recipes, and I know I'm going to want to play with them more in the future. Am I very tempted to get recipes for Wellesley Blue and the class colors? Yes. Yes, I am. Back when I was trying to pick which color I wanted to do for this video, those were very strong contenders. What am I going to do with my yarn? Well, I am going to take, I think, the two silks and weave some kind of scarf or wrap with it. And then with one of the strolls, I may dye one at a lighter depth of shade, but I also might finally knit Keith a pair of socks out of fingering weight yarn, something I've been meaning to do for a very long time. Please make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications turned on so you never miss any new videos. I enjoy dyeing things that are both more technical with recipes and also dyeing by feel and just playing around, and all of it is so much fun. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.